contemporary attention. In other words, why were politicians, senior military officers, and influential shapers of opinion so willing to play along, freely expending lives and treasure, despite the manifest mindlessness of the overall project? Perhaps I could combine those two questions into a single one, to wit, once it became apparent that the long war was a dumb idea, why did the enterprise launched in the wake of 9/11 nonetheless just drag on and on? Let me emphasize my view that the war was strategically purposeful in its earliest phases. After 9/11, the George W. Bush administration did devise a coherent strategy, and one that was in large measure consistent with the American strategic tradition. If we were to summarize this strategy in a single phrase, it would be this one: the freedom agenda. You will recall the logic behind that strategy, which rested on these three propositions. First, preventing the recurrence of 9/11 required not simply the destruction of the Al-Qaeda terror network, but the elimination of those conditions giving rise to violent anti-Western jihadism more broadly. Put simply, the imperative was to transform the Islamic world. Second, given the extent of American power, especially American military power, assumed by all to be unassailable, that transformation was not only necessary, but also feasible. Indeed, history itself seemingly affirmed that feasibility. For the architects of U.S. strategy after 9/11, the year 1945 served as a critically important reference point. A nation that had transformed Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan could surely transform the far punier entities comprising the greater Middle East, so at least decision makers persuaded themselves. Third, in pursuing its own security interests, the United States would simultaneously serve a higher good. Transforming the greater Middle East necessarily implied imparting to its 1.4 billion inhabitants the blessings of democracy, human rights, and modernity, all summed up in the word liberty. Now, some of you no doubt consider all the freedom talk that garnished the articulation of U.S. policy after 9/11 to have been fraudulent or cynical, an interpretation supported by George W. Bush's astonishing overnight conversion into a passionate Wilsonian who, in his articulation of America's purpose and ambitions, outdid Woodrow Wilson himself. I disagree. I view Bush's conversion as utterly authentic. President Bush really and truly believed what it had become expedient for him to believe. Please note, as with prior versions of the Freedom Agenda, the Bush administration's commitment to liberating oppressed Muslims was by no means selfless. What had been true as far back as the age of President Polk or President McKinley remained true in the age of the second President Bush. Liberation was not inconsistent with empire. Indeed, liberation facilitated and legitimated the peculiarly American version of empire. Although few dared say so out loud, the truth was this: liberation went hand in hand with informal dominion. Bush and his lieutenants let it be known that successful implementation of the Freedom Agenda would spell the doom of corrupt and unenlightened autocrats. Yet the Freedom Agenda would also create the conditions for the exercise of unquestioned American hegemony. After all, the events of 1945, the year of Europe's liberation from the horrors of Nazi tyranny, but also the year of Hiroshima, had installed the United States in the driver's seat in both East Asia and in Western Europe. In formulating its response to 9/11, the Bush administration sought to repeat this trick. In pursuit of these ambitious objectives, nothing would stay America's hand. Bush's promulgation of a doctrine of preventive war made that point abundantly clear. The problem with the Freedom Agenda was not a conceptual one, but a practical one. It didn't work. It never even came close. After a brief foray into Afghanistan, the Bush administration quickly latched on to Iraq as the ideal arena in which to validate the Freedom Agenda's feasibility. Iraq was to be a test case. Success there would pave the way for success elsewhere, in Syria and Iran, Egypt and Saudi Arabia, eventually all across the long arc between Morocco and the southern Philippines. But Operation Iraqi Freedom turned out to be a bust. Liberating Iraq turned out to be an exceedingly difficult proposition. American military power turned out to be far less effective than it had been cracked up to be. What became evident in Iraq was this: Washington knew how to start wars, but not how to end them. So by November 2006, the Freedom Agenda was dead. Its demise signified by elections that gave Democrats control of Congress, by the firing of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, and by Bush's decision to implement the so-called surge, prolonging the military effort in Iraq while giving up on anything remotely resembling the victory that Bush himself had for several years been promising. Now, the conventional view is that the Iraq surge succeeded, and indeed it did, in the narrow sense of averting outright defeat. Yet that limited success